Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the next part of addictions and mental health. I'm going to share my screen with you shortly. Okay, hang on, guys. So we're going to be talking about the factors. We're going to be talking about several things surrounding addictions and mental health. I just need to pull up the slides here. Hang on. Okay. Sorry, 1 second here. Just trying to open it up here. Okay. Here we go. So we're talking about the factors impacting substance use and dependency. So there are a lot of different factors that are really important in understanding this. We're going to talk about the risk factors. We're going to talk about protective factors involving dependency. We're going to talk about experimental, social, problematic, and dependence. So let's begin talking about the factors that implement substance use, abuse, and dependency. So the first thing that we've discussed before is how individual addictions can be. We kind of briefly touched on the fact that treatment has to be very personalized and individual. But here, when we kind of examine the factors that impact substance use and dependency, those are also very independent. So we have to consider biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors. And you can't expect that only one factor is present. Sometimes there's a combination of all of these factors. Some factors can include a person's genes, so maybe it runs in the family, the way your brain functions, maybe something you've experienced in the past, cultural influences, and sometimes risk factors could be stemming from social issues like poverty and other barriers. So these are all very much relevant risk factors. Now, when we talk about social determinants of health, we're talking about economic conditions. How well people are doing, their physical health, their mental health, their financial health, their overall well-being. Sometimes their ability to access certain resources. So there are certain determinants of health. So let's put aside addictions for 1 second. Let's just talk about health. So when there's been studies that have examined how the social aspect of your life leads to a really healthy being, like a health and wellness sort of thing. They examined a couple of things, and that they identified 3 main points. 1, freedom from discrimination and violence, right? So if somebody's experiencing discrimination, violence, it could be even things like systemic racism, prejudice, those are going to lead somebody down a very unhealthy lifestyle, an unhealthy path in a sense. It affects your health. It may not seem like it, but there have been studies to suggest that individuals who suffer from discrimination and violence are going to have less opportunities for healthcare, less opportunities for, having an overall wellness. Social inclusion. So if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you'll know that social needs are very important in somebody's overall well-being. If you're not familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's something we're going to discuss probably in the weeks to come. But nonetheless, social inclusion is very important. You feeling like you belong, having friends, family, and not feeling isolated. There have been many studies that suggest when people feel isolated, their health suffers. Access to economic resources, having economic resources, having money, having that financial resource in order to be able to afford certain things, medications, extra testing, all these things relate and lead back to how well you are, how healthy you are. Now, a lot of times, sometimes people of all backgrounds and beliefs can experience addiction. Sometimes people forget that. Excuse me. It can be hard sometimes to understand how one group of people or some people are prone to addiction and others are not. It doesn't matter where you brought up. It doesn't matter your moral code. It doesn't matter, what family you're from or what cultural upbringing you're coming from. The fact is, becoming addicted to alcohol, drugs, or any substance or any kind of behavior really is very individual. Your genetics, your environment, sometimes your medical history, and your age all play a role in how likely you are to become addicted to alcohol or substances or some sort of behavior. Now, certain types of drugs and methods of using them tend to be a little bit more addictive than others. Now, let's talk about genetics for a second. So, addiction isn't a matter of weak willpower. It's not somebody who has lack of morals. It's not like that. You see, the chemical reaction that happens in your brain when you have an addiction is quite different than those that happen to someone without that. So sometimes when you examine the genetics behind somebody's addiction, you have to kind of look a little deeper, like what's going on in their brain, what's going on in their genetics. It explains, so there have been studies that suggest that people who are often addicted to cigarettes, it has sort of this pleasure component to it, but they've also identified that there's a genetic component to some addictions. So if you have family members who are, experiencing addiction, unfortunately, you might be more likely to experience addiction than if you didn't have that genetic component. Now, if you have an addictive personality, some people do, you might have that genetic factor. You might have, let's say, a parent or, older sibling, younger sibling. You might have some sort of extended family member that also may have that addictive personality. Now, let's not blame family on everything. Environmental factors also can raise the risk of addiction. When children and teens don't really have a lot of parental involvement, sometimes you have single parents where the one parent is working a lot and there's not a lot of interaction with children and teens with that parent. It can actually lead to greater risk because children and teens become a little bit curious, they want to experiment. That environment now becomes conducive to this idea of using some sort of drugs, becoming addicted. And it's not in all cases. So let's take one step back and really examine this. It's not in all cases. We're just examining, kind of key factors that become that are risk factors, right? So when we talk about environment, we're talking about peer pressure. We're talking about this idea of experimentation. You kind of are curious about it. You start using or you start, partaking in that behavior, and it becomes sort of a habit. It becomes an addiction where now you're willing to kind of do anything to satisfy that need. If you remember what we talked about last week, you'll know that. Now, when we talk about a dual diagnosis, this means that you have an addictive disorder. You have something that you're addicted to, something that you need to take, otherwise you're going to you just need to take it. Whatever that drug is, whatever that substance is, whatever that behavior is. But in addition to that addictive disorder that you're experiencing, if you've been diagnosed with a mental health condition, like, for example, depression, this is now where you have two diagnoses. So you're going to have a dual diagnosis. So not only are you now diagnosed with an addictive disorder, but you may also be diagnosed with a mental health condition. This is not uncommon. And oftentimes the two go hand in hand. This is why this course is titled Addictions and Mental Health, because the two go hand in hand. It's not uncommon to be diagnosed with, let's say, an addictive disorder and then also experience underlying mental health issues. Now, other medical conditions can also increase your risk of addiction. For example, prescription pain pills after a surgery. Maybe you have an injury of some sort and drugs, alcohol, or whatnot becomes your coping mechanism. That also can lead to addictions. Now, there have been studies that suggest that young adults between the ages of 18 and 24 are more likely at that point to develop certain addictive behaviors. So early use, meaning, starting to use certain substances at a very young age, tend to lead you down the path of addictive behavior. This can also impact, your brain development, the likelihood of you being able to kind of fully develop. It affects your overall well-being. Now, drug of choice, believe it or not, the drugs that certain people choose to partake in also play a huge role in how likely they are to become addicted. So, if you're using cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, they tend to be more physically addictive than, let's say, alcohol or marijuana. If you use cocaine or heroin, the withdrawal or come down phase tends to be really, really painful. And then this will push you to use more often and use in higher doses to prevent that withdrawal symptom. Also, the way in which something is used. So, for example, drugs that are smoked or injected into the body tend to be more addictive because when you're injecting or when you're smoking a substance, it goes straight into the bloodstream and into the brain. So you get a really quick effect from it. But if you're using drugs that take a little bit more time to be absorbed into the body, they're not as addictive because you don't get that quick fix from it. Now let's talk about prevention for a minute. Even if you have identified, let's say that you have these risk factors, can you combat them? Can you overcome them? So oftentimes, you would talk to your doctor in order to learn a little bit more about addiction. Some medical practitioners will recommend many different different forms of prevention, many different forms of treatment. Some will recommend, and for the most part, will recommend abstinence when it comes to those substances or those behaviors. For example, avoiding drinking alcohol or using drugs or practicing other addictive behaviors. But if somebody suspects that they may have addiction, the first, point of contact should be their doctor. Now, I did mention social determinants a moment ago, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it now. While the social determinants of health are part and parcel of addictions and substance use, as I said before, there's no one single factor. You can't pinpoint and say, well, I became addicted because, specifically only let's say I have family members who are also experiencing addictive behaviors. It's not only one thing. It's not only social, it's not only biological, it's not only physical or psychological. It has to be a combination of several things. Now, addictions and mental health. Now, this particular slide is a really, really kind of like packed in there. And the reason why I did that was because there's so much information here. But there are key factors I want to point out to you. One, as I said before, addictions and substance use and mental health issues are concurrent disorders. They go hand in hand. One sort of leans up against the other. They go together. And that's the reason why they're treated almost simultaneously. Before we talked about it as a dual diagnosis, but it also can be kind of termed as a concurrent disorder. Now, sometimes it can be very difficult to figure out how many people are really, really addicted or really experiencing addiction and mental health issues because it's so underreported. So many people are scared to come forward and say, you know what, I have a problem, I'm addicted, or I have a mental illness, because there's such a stigma attached to it. There's such stigma and discrimination attached to individuals who are suffering from addiction and mental health. And that leads to a very negative stereotype and discrimination. And sometimes people feel that, well, I can't really get the treatment I need because if anybody finds out that I'm addicted or I have these mental health issues, it's going to be very difficult and I don't want to go down that path. But it's so important that you do get that help and get the diagnosis so that you can get the appropriate treatment. Now, researchers have found that some aspects of a person's life that can contribute to an individual becoming less likely to have substance use or addictions are called protective factors. So these are the things that are happening in somebody's life that protect them from becoming addicted. So let's say if in your family you have that addictive disorder, here are ways that that addictive disorder can be counterbalanced. So having a childhood with a positive adult role model, being motivated and having personal goals, so wanting to, accomplish something will offset the other factors we just went through. Involvement in meaningful activities and connected to a positive and reliable community of support. So as you can see, there's a lot of positive factors that can counterbalance somebody's likelihood of being addicted. Now, understanding addictions, couple things that I want to talk about. So there's this sort of abbreviation called the 4 C's, or this sort of this sort of little way of remembering, or a simple way of understanding and describing addiction by using what they call the 4C approach. So addictions are based on cravings, loss of control of amount or frequency of use, compulsion to use, and continued substance use despite consequences. So you can see the C, right? So if you ever need to kind of like think back, what causes addiction? So you can use the 4C approach. Now, that kind of simplifies it, but you always have to remember that addictions and mental health is a complex thing. It's where problematic patterns of substance use can interfere with a person's life. We kind of defined addictions, and so we're not going to go through it too much right now, but I just wanted to kind of go back and remind everybody that behavioral addiction is also an addiction just as much as substance addiction is as well, right? Anything that will disrupt your life that you feel you cannot exist with is an addiction. Now, there are a couple of treatment options, and one very popular one and one very commonly used one is harm reduction. What is harm reduction? It's an evidence-based, client-centered approach. Remember, client-centered. Everything has to be individual. And it seeks to reduce the health and social harms associated with addiction. So what happens is it's not necessarily requiring people to just stop cold turkey, stop using or stop partaking in that behavior, but rather it's almost as though you're weaning somebody off it. So you provide a person the channel or the medium to partake in whatever this behavior is or whatever the substance is in a very non-judgmental way, but also providing them with the positive factors, right? The protective factors to try to offset that need and that addiction that has developed. So you try to create a very non-judgmental environment, non-coercive strategies. You try to enhance skills, knowledge to live safer and healthier lives. Now, sometimes harm reduction acknowledges that a lot of people kind of cope with addiction and they remain abstinent from their substance of choice, and it may not be possible for them to abstain from their substance of choice. That is very, very difficult. Harm reduction also engages the individual with this addiction to collaborate with those supports, those community supports, social service supports and whatnot, so that they can gain the extra supports that they need in order to be able to kind of redirect their lives in a different way. Ultimately, the goal is to get them, away from that addiction, but in a very individually targeted way. Some harm reduction initiatives also reduce certain bloodborne diseases. So for example, when let's say if somebody has contracted HIV or AIDS or hepatitis C, and they're partaking in certain, let's say, substances, well, providing them with, let's say, clean needles or, an environment, a safer environment to partake in that medication, in that substance, or provide them with certain medications, may reduce the likelihood of them, you know, either spreading the illness or basically aggravating the illness as well, right? Making it even worse. So that kind of reduces the rates of deaths due to drug overdoses as well as, like I said, aggravating certain illnesses. Now, an example of harm reduction would be like a nicotine patch. So you're not taking away the nicotine, but you're adjusting the delivery of the nicotine. Rather than smoking, you give them a nicotine patch. Consuming water while drinking alcohol. So you're not drinking alcohol, but you're diluting the alcohol by consuming water as well. Using substances in a safe environment with someone they trust so that you can be sure that if you do partake in that substance, you know you're not going to overdose. And needle exchange programs for people who inject drugs. So again, creating that safe environment so that you can that person can feel a little bit safer, and partake in that, but in a safe way. Now, harm reduction doesn't just apply to the use of substances. We engage in harm reduction in our everyday lives, right? For example, when you wear a helmet when you ride a bike, right? Or enforcing seatbelts when driving in a car. We try to reduce the possibility of harm happening to us. So, a couple main features of harm reduction. One, it's pragmatic. It recognizes that substance use is gonna happen, but how can we do it in a way to minimize potential harms? Humane values. We try to consider, not being judgmental to people who are using substances. And we focus on the harm. We look at all the different ways that somebody can harm themselves by using this substance or partaking in this behavior, and we try to reduce it. Goals of harm reduction, as I said, to prevent the negative consequences of substance use. Now, we know that substance use does have a lot of harm, a lot of consequences, so we try to reduce as much as possible. Now, I mentioned before protective factors, but let's talk a little bit more about that. Protective factors are really very important because what they do, as I said, they counterbalance the negative. So even though you may be likely to be, developing an addictive personality because of all of those other factors we discussed, social, environmental, biological, but if we are able to counterbalance it, we may save people from developing addictive personalities. How do we do that? Well, as I said before, we give them various different counterbalance type of factors. So, for example, offering peer groups, right? Ensuring certain income levels, right? Providing positive childhood experiences and improving employment status. Now, let's step back for 1 second. Let's examine the risk factors. I know we're kind of going back and forth, but I want to kind of tie everything together as we move through. So we just talked about proactive factors. When we talk about risk factors, let's divide the two. So we have individual level risk factors, right? And we have individual level protective factors. When we talk about individual risk factors, we're talking about genetic predisposition. How likely are you to develop addictive disorders, because that's just your biology. And then you have individual level protective factors, which are self-image, self-control, self-competence. If we can take those individual level protective factors and counterbalance them, make them more powerful, make them stronger within an individual to overcome the genetic predisposition, we can successfully try to avoid somebody developing addictive disorders, right? Now, for example, if all people have biological and psychological characteristics, right, that might make them vulnerable to certain behaviors and whatnot. But if we're able to counterbalance that, as I said, we can overcome those the predisposition to addictions, right? So now, for example, in a relationship, risk factors include parents who use drug, alcohol, and who suffer from mental illness. How do we counterbalance that? So in this context, a parental involvement is an example of a protective factor. Let's say if we have somebody in that family who's able to sort of be there as a solid support system, you can sometimes counterbalance all of the negative risk factors that lead to somebody becoming or developing an addictive personality. Another one, in communities, risk factors include neighborhood poverty and violence. How do we create protective factors to that? So creating faith-based resources, after-school activities, community support, social services. In society, risk factors can include norms and laws favorable to substance use, as well as racism and a lack of economic opportunity. So protective factors would be, let's combat hate crimes. Let's develop hate crime laws. Let's, limit the availability of certain substances. Now, risk factors and protective factors are correlated and cumulative. What that means is that risk factors are positively correlated with another and negatively correlated to protective factors. In other words, people who have these risk factors have a greater chance of experiencing even more. And they are less likely to have these protective factors. So somebody who's, let's say, genetically predisposed to, let's say, alcohol, developing addiction disorder to alcohol because their family is addicted to alcohol, love alcohol, they drink alcohol. If that's part of that, let's say, individual's environment, that's what they're used to, that's part of their social upbringing, the protective factors that are in that environment may also be limiting, right? They might be limited because of the environment. Now, if you're able to now, if the risk and protective factors tend to have a cumulative effect on development or may reduce development or behavioral health issues. So as I said, so if you have all of this, all of these factors present in this environment, it can change in one way, in one direction or another, depending on the situation, depending on the person. Young people with multiple risk factors have a greater likelihood of developing a condition that impacts their physical or mental health. Young people with multiple protective factors are at a reduced risk, right? So if the more protective factors you have, the less likely you are going to be experiencing addictive disorder, right? So these correlations underscore the importance of early intervention, multiple protective factors, and making sure that you have multiple protective factors as supports. Now, through preventative interventions, there's a couple of things that I want to just mention here. Negative life events are also very present when it comes to addictive disorders. Something happens in a person's life and it dramatically affects their likelihood to develop addictive disorders, right? As are prevention efforts. So just as much as a negative event in somebody's life can lead to a certain behavior, the potential to produce positive effects and positive events can also lead to positive effects as far as addictive behaviors. Now, risk and the risk factors and protective factors can influence and can be very present in a person's entire lifespan, meaning at an early age and adulthood and so on and so forth, because your life, as you go through your life, you go through a number of different things. So the example here is risk factor could be poverty and family dysfunction and can later lead to mental or substance use disorders, but such a family may also influence or be influenced by other factors or another context. Now, when you examine this situation, you go through your whole life in in this environment, in this sort of social setting, and these factors, whether it be risk factors or protective factors, can be influencing your entire life, positive or negative. So life events like poverty, divorce, somebody passing away, let's say bereavement, parental mental illness, all of those things will lead to a person potentially developing addictive disorder. Now, positive life events can also be very it can create a very profound impact as far as offsetting that addictive disorder as well. Universal selective and indicated prevention interventions. So this sort of is kind of a very general idea. I just want to kind of point out a couple of key points here. Prevention interventions fall into three broad categories. One, in universal prevention. So it's sort of like this overall broad stroke prevention program. So something that you might see at school, don't do drugs, don't use alcohol, don't partake, and so on and so forth. So kind of like a broad thing, something you might see on a advertisement on a bus shelter, for example. Selective interventions are when we're trying to target biological, psychological, or social risk factors. So this is now where we're kind of targeting something more specific. So one example would be prevention education for immigrant families with young children. We're being very specific. We're not putting an advertisement on a bus shelter like we did with the universal preventative intervention. We're being very specific. We're selecting specific groups to target that we've identified that need this extra information, that need this extra support. And then we have indicated preventative interventions targets. This is where you find somebody, one person, two people, a family, and you're specifically providing them with the supports that they need. Okay. Now there's a couple of stages of drug use, okay? And when we talk about the stages of drug use, it also kind of gives you a good idea of how an addiction is developed too, right? So there's this theory of continuum of drug use. So where a person will now partake in drug use and on sort of like on a continuous basis. And they make a decision based on education, harm minimization, policing, and all of these things, all of these policymakers that have developed this, theory and developed this idea of, treatment opportunities and whatnot. They, there's this sort of mandate or this push or this philosophy that that when somebody is suffering, let's say from financial hardships, doesn't become harmed due to the use of substance, the main culprit is, let's say, drug use, right? Now, if the person also starts developing adverse reactions from the drug, then there's even considerable problems with the relationships around them and so on and so forth. So we kind of talked about this before, we kind of touched upon drug use, but there are stages to drug use, and this is what we're going to talk about. So the first one is the stages are defined in the continuum like non-use. So you're not using. The second step is experimental use. You're going to try it out a little bit, see out of curiosity what it's all about. Recreational, it becomes not something so novel, it's not new to you, but you kind of use it here and there. Social, you kind of do it only when you're with your friends. But now when you start using regularly, it becomes a little bit of a different situation. And then that regular use now leads to you becoming dependent, compulsive, and addicted. Experimental use, as I said before, is where you're kind of exploring, you're testing it out, you're trying to see what this is all about. It basically stems from pretty much natural curiosity. Recreational is where, like I said, where you're, using when you go out with your friends, social events, going out. I mean, with COVID, we're not really going out much, but nonetheless, this is where you would probably partake as a recreational user. When regular use kicks in, this is now where you start using, let's say, on a weekly basis. You start using every weekend. You start using where now it's almost part of your schedule, okay? That is now the precursor to dependency. When a person becomes compulsive to use a substance, whatever that substance is or whatever that behavior is, and not using it leads to withdrawal and really negative outcomes, like somebody starts, experiencing almost those withdrawal symptoms where they start, becoming ill or unwell due to now this substance or this behavior being removed, that now is considered to be dependent use. Now, that dependent use oftentimes is paired with, you know, consequences leading to poor health, issues with social status, issues with relationships, issues with finances, and many issues with emotional well-being. When that starts happening, this is now where a person is already leading into dependent use. Now, throughout history, people have tried to kind of understand what is the, why is it that people are using drugs when they know it's so bad for them? So here we're going to discuss that. So we have initially during the 18th and 19th century, addiction was viewed as a sin. It was a moral issue. People looked at it as a moral issue. In fact, a lot of people still believe it's a moral issue. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, oftentimes consequences led to, let's say, things like, whippings, public beatings, stocks, fines, public ridicule. There was a lot of issues tied to addictions. Now, spiritual direction was a common treatment, so often seeking out sort of religious intervention, spiritual intervention. Jail sentences were another form of punishment. Um, and at the turn of the century, many more drug users were put in mental hospitals and pretty much because jails became so full. Now, moving forward, the disease model. Now, the disease model is where, it starts looking at addictions and mental health as a medical issue, not as a necessarily a criminal issue, but now as a medical issue. This is now where addicted people can receive the supports that they need. There is this idea that addiction can be reversible, but not really cured. Okay. Now, the psychodynamic model developed by Sigmund Freud, and it's still used today pretty much in terms of treating people with drug problems and substance use problems. What they're trying to do is link what's happening to you now with what happened to you as a child. So something happened to you as a child, you basically, buried it deep into your subconscious, and now because of that, you're starting to develop addictive disorders. There's also this entire this entire theory having to do with Sigmund Freud, that your addictive personalities stem not only from your subconscious, because he had this whole model of subconscious with the id, ego, and superego, but and this is something you probably will discuss if you should decide to take psychology, like an introductory into psychology course. But Sigmund Freud also believed that a person's childhood events will directly lead them into developing certain behaviors in adulthood, including addictive disorders. Now, we also have social learning model. This is very, very interesting. This is kind of a little bit newer than, let's say, the moral model. So we're talking about the 1970s, and basically what it talks about is that people learn how to do things. People learn from their environment, through their social settings, through the people around them, through conditioning, through modeling, through thinking about what's going on. They start to develop dependence and start to develop addictive behaviors. And they don't solely attribute the addiction to chemical dependence, but also behavior and social. So basically, you develop an addictive behavior because of, you're engaging in this. It's very pleasurable. You've learned that behavior. You've been around people who partake in certain addictive behaviors. You wanting to know more about this behavior, and then you start to develop almost like a habit or addiction to that specific behavior or that specific substance. Now, social cultural model, it's been popular, as it says, in the last 15 years. I would say that probably maybe even a little bit longer. These models focus on society. So we're not talking about just one person who's addicted. We're looking at it as a society as a whole. This was actually the model that they used in Portugal. So those of you who are not familiar with this, and I'm going to be posting a link so you can read a little bit more about it. In Portugal, they were trying to combat this huge problem that they were experiencing there. And there were people who were overdosing. The drug addiction problems in Portugal were out of control. So the government and the social service programs that they had there decided, you know what, we can't continue doing this. We got to figure out a more effective way of dealing with drug addiction. So what they did was they changed the laws, they changed the policies, and individuals who were exhibiting addictive disorder were no longer going to be criminally charged. Rather, instead of treating it as a criminal behavior, they started to treat it as a mental health issue or a medical issue. And when they did that, they completely changed things. And now treating those individuals rather than putting them in jail became a very effective way of dealing with addiction disorder. Now, we also have the public health model. So this one talks about this idea of treatment and prevention. It says here Australia. I shouldn't say Australia, but this program it stems from Australia. Okay, so Australia, this public health model actually was first developed there, and it's an integrated approach and it identifies three characteristics. One, the agent, so characteristics of an effect of the drug itself. So what is the drug? We're going to figure out what the drug is. Number two, who is the user? Who's using this drug? And three, where and how is the drug being used? Okay, so we figured that part out. Great. Now let's figure out how do we prevent it. So this public health model kind of created in Australia looked at the philosophy of harm, not reduction, but harm, in a sense reduction, but what they termed it as harm minimization. So they accept this idea of using the drugs like harm reduction does, right? But by reducing or minimizing the harm that's caused because of it, is a better way than just trying to eliminate it, because there's an understanding that you can't eliminate it. So the first part of this idea of the interaction model. So we've already determined what the drug is about, who's using it and how. Okay, so let's now examine primary prevention. So we're going to examine how is it that how do we ensure that this doesn't occur in the first place? So more of a preventative type philosophy. So through community development, drug education, media-based strategies. The second one is, let's identify at what point can we pinpoint early stages of addiction to prevent it from continuing on, right? And territory prevention, right, is when we consider the problem to be serious, it's affecting the person's health, finances, relationships, and even legally. How do we treat it? Now, when we have these three key factors, and we approach this interaction model, we're kind of pinpointing this prevention, because the primary and secondary prevention is before these three characteristics, these three factors come into play. Okay. Now, this model in particular is pretty much used quite often. This is sort of like an identifying pretty much the structure, the basics of what's happening, as far as, what's happening with the drug use itself. And then we take it and move it into the interaction model, and we identify prevention strategies. Okay. Now, that is pretty much it for this week. Next week, we're going to talk about the effects. So today we talked about the factors, the risk factors, and we talked about the protective factors of addiction disorder. Next week, we're going to talk about what happens to your mind, to your body, to your family, to your entire life, to you, if you become, if you start developing addiction disorder, or if you start developing mental health disorders in addition or concurrently with addiction disorder. Okay, so that's it for me today. I hope you all are well, and I will see you guys next week. Please keep in mind that if you have any questions, please reach out to me by email. I'm more than happy to answer emails. Also, please keep in mind that your weekly online activity has been posted, so please make sure that you complete that as well. If you have any questions, please reach out to your home school teacher. I'm sure she would be more than happy to assist you in any way possible. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful week.